Good evening. My name is Jim Whitty, and I am director of the Institute for Immigration Research at George Mason University. And I'm very privileged and honored to welcome all of you tonight to the fourth annual New American Voices Award, where we celebrate rising young new American authors. This year, we are honoring our three finalists, Daisy Hernández, Anthony So, and Patricia Engel. Patricia and Daisy are here online tonight. And very sadly, Anthony passed away and will be represented by his editor, a voice we lost too early. What we're going to do is, I'm just going to briefly introduce this. We at the Institute for Immigration Research, we really focus on the contributions that immigrants make to America. And our main focus is economic contributions, but we also emphasize the cultural contributions. And this is where we have decided, and our sponsor and donor, who you're going to hear from, our representative of the Immigrant Learning Center in Malden, Massachusetts, that we really understand that it's not the economic contributions, but these cultural contributions. And with that, I'm going to pass off the virtual microphone to Denzel Mohammed, who's going to tell you a little bit about the Immigrant Learning Center and the work that we're doing together in partnership to give voice in so many ways to new Americans. Denzel, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you, Professor Whitty. I'm so excited to join all of you as we celebrate the 2021 New American Voices Award. As he said, my name is Denzel Mohammed. I direct the Immigrant Learning Center's Public Education Institute, and we are strong supporters of the New American Voices Award and to all new American voices yearning to be heard. The Immigrant Learning Center is a not-for-profit in Malden, Massachusetts, and we've been giving immigrant and refugee adults a voice for 29 years in three ways. First, we provide free English and citizenship classes to immigrant and refugee adults so that they can become successful workers and community members. So far, we've helped 11,000 immigrants from 122 countries. Second, through our Public Education Institute, we educate the American public, including policymakers, the media, students, teachers, religious and business leaders, about the positive impact immigrants have on our country, economy, and our communities. And third, research. As part of educating the public and informing policy, it's necessary to present the facts, truth. So 9 years ago, we partnered with George Mason University to establish the Institute for Immigration Research. They've been documenting the contributions of immigrants, for instance, the disproportionately large share of Nobel laureates in the US. And we'll see that again this year. 5 of the 13 US laureates are immigrants. And they've revealed the critical role of immigrant essential workers to get us through this pandemic. Indeed, both Pfizer and Moderna have immigrant founders. Next month, the Public Education Institute will release a research report documenting the impact and experiences of these immigrant essential workers. In a strange contradiction, many of these immigrant workers, in fact, many immigrants, are invisible. We don't know them. And yet immigrants are the go-to in nightly cable news shows for what is somehow wrong with America. Facts are important. Data is important. But these alone cannot change hearts and minds. That's why we have the New American Voices Award, to share the stories of the lives, journeys, ambitions, and dreams of these new Americans, which is crucial to reclaiming the narrative around immigration. The immigrant experience is inextricably linked to the American experience. We at the Immigrant Learning Center understand this because we were founded by an immigrant, Diane Portnoy, who fled post-World War II Europe for survival and a chance at a future. In one generation, she was able to start a not-for-profit that's going to be 30 years old next year. Save the date for our grand anniversary gala, November 9, 2022. And we hear these stories every day from our students. Students who fled genocide in the middle of the night, gang violence and incessant poverty, earthquakes and famine, just lacking the chance at a real, fulfilling life. The people who choose to uproot their lives and flee are those yearning for freedom and opportunity, those with a dream, the American dream. And we've seen this in generation after generation in this country's vivid immigrant history. That's what built the United States of America. In today's charged climate around immigration, the scale and poignancy with which Patricia Engel, Daisy Hernández, and Anthony Veasna So document their respective stories needs to be told and shared widely for all Americans of every origin to see. It is why the Immigrant Learning Center is proud to partner with the Institute for Immigration Research to honor immigrant authors every year. Congratulations to the 2021 New American Voices finalists, and a heartfelt gratitude for Anthony's short but amazing life. We are lucky to have 3 such brilliant examples of new American literature. Now,
well said, Denzel.
Now I'd like to introduce you to a very special person. Melissa Rivero was born in Lima, Peru, and raised in Brooklyn, New York. She became a US citizen after being undocumented for most of her life. Her writing has taken her to the Middlebury Bread Loaf Writers Conference and the Norman Mailer Writers Colony. Rivera is a graduate of NYU and Brooklyn Law School, and she now works on the legal team of a startup. She is also the 2019 New American Voices Award winner for her first novel, The Affairs of the Falcons. Welcome back, Melissa.
Thank you to Jim and Denzel. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we celebrate this year's finalists for the New American Voices Award. First of all, congratulations to Daisy and to Helen for these incredible books. Frankly, they really stood out. We had a wonderful array of books that we read, and these two in particular really resonated on a personal level. They were highlights of my reading this year so far, so thank you very much. Daisy Hernández is a former reporter for the New York Times and has been writing about the intersections of race, immigration, class, and sexuality for almost 2 decades. Hernández is the author most recently of The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease. Helen Atsma, Vice President and Editorial Director of ECHO, will be speaking about Anthony Veasna So's work. Anthony Veasna So was a graduate of Stanford University and earned his MFA in fiction at Syracuse University. Daisy, if I can, I would like to start with just a few questions for you about your book, The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease. Now, this book really does start with family. Your aunt was afflicted for many years with Chagas. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
You are.
Yeah. Okay, otherwise known as the kissing bug disease, which she contracted in Colombia and came here to the United States and received some treatment for. Can you tell us, first off, how it is that you decided that this was a topic that you wanted to explore in your writing, and how it was that you came to construct the work?
Absolutely. Yeah, I did not expect to write this book, actually. I was writing a short story. Initially, I was writing fiction about Chagas disease and a girl and her mom. And as I was writing that short story, I began to research more and realized that I knew so little about this disease, even though my auntie had been diagnosed when I was very young, and I had grown up knowing that she had this disease. I thought it was very rare. And as I began to do more research, I learned that there's 300,000 people in the United States who have this disease. And all of those people are like my auntie. They're immigrants from South America or Central America or Mexico. And so at that point, I realized this isn't a rare disease. It's actually a neglected disease. And it raised a lot of questions for me of why has this disease been so neglected for so long, considering how many Latinx immigrants suffer from it in the United States. It's a parasitic disease that does not have a cure. 1 in 3 people end up having cardiac complications to the point that they need defibrillators, even heart transplants. So it's very serious. My own auntie lost her life to this disease. I had another auntie in South America who also died from Chagas disease. And it was incredible to me that there wasn't a book in English for a general readership about this disease and what families were struggling with in the United States. So I actually began with an article for The Atlantic about how Chagas disease was being identified among Latinx families actually in the DC metro area. So that was like the first story. And as I researched for that story, I just realized that there was so much more that I wanted to learn about the disease, that I really wanted to address this larger question about how we make decisions about who we take care of as a community, as a country, as, you know, a global society as well. And so that ended up being 7 years of research and of writing this book.
And what kind of research, what did that research entail? Because I know that it involved you going to Colombia too, right? And so it wasn't just research here in the United States, but it was really digging in deep into how that disease affected folks in Colombia as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did end up, as you're saying, going back to Colombia, initially interviewing experts. So a biologist who had dedicated his entire life to studying the parasite and also particularly insect that transmit this. Chagas disease in some ways is a little similar to Lyme disease in the sense that you're not going to catch it from being in a room with someone. It's not like the flu or let alone COVID. You're generally, the primary way is going to be that you have contact with these insects. So I ended up in Colombia in actually a lab where insects were being kept and raised, and studies were being done, trying to figure out, you know, all sorts of things, you know, how these insects are able to transmit the parasite. The parasite has a really complicated system inside of this bug. And so I spent a lot of time there and interviewing this person who had just dedicated 30 years of his life. It was really an amazing experience, who had actually found the parasite in the really ancient mummies in South America, in Peru and Chile. So interviewing him was an incredible experience. And then, yes, I basically went into communities actually pretty close to where my auntie grew up, in a part of Colombia where it's easy to find the kissing bug. And there I was interviewing families who are themselves, you know, patients who are developing cardiac complications because this parasite can actually lie dormant in the body for up to 30 years. So someone can be infected as a child, but not actually have symptoms until much later in life. So one woman that I write about, Alex, she recounted so vividly, you know, as a child having exposure to these insects. They were all around her home. These are rural homes. These are in the mountainous areas of Colombia. And, but she didn't start to have any cardiac complications until now in her 40s and 50s. So it was really quite extraordinary to be able to hear their stories, to be able to share their stories with readers as well. And it was the, you know, the other side to hearing stories from immigrants in the US, because I also traveled from DC to Texas to California and interviewed families in the US who, like similar to the families in Colombia, had never actually heard about the disease, even though they were really familiar with the insect, because they had seen it as children growing up. They actually didn't know anything about the disease itself until they started having those cardiac complications that bring them into contact with the medical system.
Mm. What did you find that was surprising or that struck you in your research?
I think you know, specifically in the United States, just the incredible challenges that immigrant families face in terms of accessing healthcare. So a lot of times people think it's just getting health insurance, but it's actually more complicated than that, right? Because you have to feel a sense of agency and empowerment to actually go into a doctor's office and say, I want to be tested for this. You have to actually even know about the disease to begin with. You have to have a lot of knowledge also of how the medical system works in the US, the fact that you have a primary care doctor who then goes to an infectious disease specialist, refers you, right? So a lot of immigrant families just don't have knowledge of how that works, let alone feel a sense of agency. They're also often grappling with so many other issues that can sometimes feel more urgent. So one of the patients that I write about in the book, Carlos, the family member who was taking care of him when he got his heart transplant, because that's the point to which the disease progressed for him, was that he did need a heart transplant. And And the person who was taking care of him was his sister-in-law, who had just been in a detention center in Texas for the last year and a half. And so a lot of what this family was preoccupied with was her asylum case, and what would happen to her. And here she is actually in a caretaker role day in and day out with her brother-in-law as he went through this transplant procedure and in the aftermath of that. So to me, it was just, it was really just, I think that was, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but it really underscored just how much families are facing. I think the part that maybe was surprising was that I understood that in the US, there hasn't been that much awareness among doctors. That's beginning to change, but historically there hasn't been that much awareness of this disease. It's been seen as Chagas disease as something that happens in another place. So there hasn't been that awareness of the way that migration and public health intersect. But I was really surprised that when I went to Colombia, there are doctors there. There's such a rural urban divide as well, that doctors who are growing up in cities and are going to medical schools in cities don't necessarily know about the disease either, because it's being seen as something that only happens in rural areas. So when they go do their rural or their year where they're actually working in the countryside as doctors, there's a lot of times when they're first having their contact with patients who have this disease. So I guess what was surprising was realizing the level of global health awareness, that it's global, right? Like the need to raise awareness about this neglected disease is really global. It's not only in the US.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just lastly, how did this, because I mean, it is really your aunt, right? Your aunt was sort of, her illness was an impetus or a gateway for you to explore this topic. How was it to interweave aspects of your relationship with her with the more journalistic aspects that you touch upon?
Yeah, I think so. My auntie and I had very much a mother-daughter relationship. And as I write in the book, a really complicated one. This was not like a lovey-dovey mom and daughter relationship. This was more, we were always butting heads. And when I came out as queer, she really struggled with her own homophobia around that and never fully accepted me identifying as bisexual. So we had a very complicated relationship. And for me, I think the journalism was actually kind of a relief from the grief that I felt about losing her, because it was such a complicated grief. And so I think throwing myself into interviewing people and writing their stories was actually such a reprieve. But I did need to write the story about my relationship with her. So in some ways, I almost started on the outside in terms of like interviewing experts, interviewing other families, and then bringing it home to myself. Is the story about me and my auntie is probably the last part of what I wrote, even though it's throughout the book. And in a lot of ways, it helped me to make sense of the grief. I think I had an erroneous idea that we can only grieve people that we have like a super loving, amazing relationship with, but grieving someone who we have such a complicated relationship with is its own kind of grief. It has different layers and textures to it. And so a lot of the book is also coming to some kind of I don't know if resolution is the right word, but coming to terms with how complicated that grief is with my auntie.
Yeah, and how insightful that you had to zoom out before you could actually zoom in. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much
thank
for
you.
that. Helen, thank you for being here and taking the time to talk about Anthony's remarkable short story collection, Afterparties. The book centers Cambodian Americans living in California, and we see that community primarily through the eyes of its first generation children. Or adults. And, sadly, Anthony has passed away, and he passed away before the collection came out. Could you tell us what it was like to work with him on this collection?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to Anthony's work. And you know what, it was terrific to work with him on this. Anthony passed away last December, and the book came out in August, but we were kind of far ahead of the publication, if you will. And so a lot about the book was done, which makes me so happy. The editorial process was really fluid. We just had a lot of conversations about the book, a lot of back and forth about it, but he had a strong vision from the beginning of what this collection was. Some of the stories were done essentially, and some, we worked on quite a bit in the months after I acquired the collection. But he got to see kind of the whole package of the book. We found an illustrator to do the cover who is Cambodian, and it was the kind of thing where we showed this artist's work to Anthony, I think at the end of the summer, and he was like, yes, this is the guy. I love this tone. I love the spirit of this. And that illustrator, Moni Reek, just every step of the way with that cover, it just came together seamlessly in a way, frankly, covers rarely do. And Anthony absolutely loved it. He, I think, saw every blurb that came in for the book. He oversaw, together with me, the way we talked about the book, all of the copy for it. And so while he never held a copy in his hands, which just, I find it's awful. I'm glad that he got to see, he had an early taste of how the world was responding to his writing, and the response was so profound and powerful and moving. And obviously that continued on through the publication.
Yeah, I mean, these characters, some of them have just a spark left in them, but yet he brings them to life and they just ignite on the page, like through every story. It's really remarkable how he was able to do that, and really just a joy to read. So it's a little bit sad to hear that he didn't get to see the final product. How did you all decide on the structure and on how to place the stories, which ones were going to make it in and which ones, were sort of going to leave for another day?
Yeah, so the stories that were on submission are all in the book. We didn't cut any along the way, but they're in a different order than they were originally. It kind of became clear as we were editing that that the story that the collection ends on, which is actually the one that is, it's not quite from the point of view of an immigrant, but it's more sharing the story of that woman who is loosely modeled on Anthony's mother, which he was open about. In that story, a woman is telling a story to her child about a school shooting that she was witness to as a teacher in California. And in telling that story to her grown son, is also linking it to the trauma of her past of leaving Cambodia and also the world that she wants her children to live in today. And I think it became clear to Anthony that that was a good place to end the collection. There are 3 stories in the collection that are loosely linked. I call them the Mally stories because they follow that character over the course of the years, and kind of giving those stories room to breathe, not running them one after the other, but also allowing them to move forward linearly in time. That was important to him. So things like that we worked on to give the collection balance. But again, he had the stories as they were on submission, again, those are all in the collection. I don't think Anthony wrote a bad story, and I think one of the things I love about his work is that he also never wrote the same story twice. So even with the Mally stories, they're prismatic. Each one is, from a different angle. It's shedding light on a different part of her life. Some of the stories I think are hysterically funny. Anthony was also kind of at one point in his life wanted to be a stand-up comic, and you can see that wit and that humor just, cut through so many of these. And some of the stories are more somber. And I think as an editor, that's one of the things that drew me to the collection. I have the good fortune of getting to read a lot of story collections on submission, and so many of them are fantastic, but often you'll kind of think, okay, there are 3 like standout stories here, and maybe others aren't quite at that level. In Anthony's case, I just think he brought his dazzling talent to each and every story. And so that's why the collection, I think, reads as cohesively as it does, even while each story is quite different from the other.
Yeah, generational differences, right? That was the last story.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember the ending. I remember feeling like it was like it was a question, right? And it was simultaneously a gut punch, but also
Yes.
just so introspective. And yeah, it was a wonderful way to end it, for sure. Is there anything else that can we see any more of his work? Is there anything else left?
Yeah, so actually we are going to be publishing another book by Anthony, probably in early 2023. Anthony was also an incredible essayist. One of his essays was published posthumously in the New Yorker not long ago, but he had essays that were published kind of everywhere before I acquired Afterparties and after. And he was also at work on a novel, which sadly he did not finish. The first portion of that novel, the chapters, some of them almost do read like linked stories. The chapters form their own sort of narrative whole, even though they were part of a larger whole, of course. But what we're doing is we're going to publish some of those chapters as short fiction together with his essays. And I just think his voice was so uncommon, both with just his sheer literary talent, his writing, the prose, but also the community he was writing about has been underrepresented in literature, absolutely. And it just, I'm really glad that we're going to be able to do one more book by him.
Yes, that's wonderful. Really, really wonderful news.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Congratulations again for being finalists. And to our audience, thank you for spending time with us. And if you have yet to read these two incredible books, I strongly urge you to go and get them. They really are remarkable. So thank you both. We'd now like to welcome Judge Irena Reyn and this year's winner of the 2021 award, Patricia Engel.
So thank you to Melissa, Daisy, and Helen. And as one of the judges of the New American Voices Award this year, I would like to introduce the winner of this year's award. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, and then we're going to hear from Patricia's wonderful novel and have a little bit of a conversation about it. So here is Patricia Engel's bio. She is the author of Infinite Country, The Veins of the Ocean, It's Not Love, It's Just Paris, and Vita. She is a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Born to Colombian parents and herself a dual citizen, Patricia is an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Miami. And now I'm going to read to you what we, the three of us judges, have written about the winner of Infinite Country. Engrossing and daring from the very first sentence, Engel's novel is the story of one Colombian family finding their way back to each other across countries and pasts that both propel them forward and haunt them. Engel tells their journey masterfully over the course of 2 decades, shifting perspectives and employing Andean myths to give us insight into her characters. In the process, she demonstrates how neither time nor borders can contain this family's connection or their love. On behalf of this year's judges and the Institute for Immigration Research, we are so pleased to be presenting Infinite Country with the 2021 New American Voices Award. Congratulations, Patricia.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored. Thanks, Irena. And I'm so grateful to you and Justin Torres and Melissa Rivero for selecting my book and to be in such incredible company with Daisy and Anthony.
Would you like to read a short selection from your book?
Sure.
And then we'll have a conversation.
Yeah, I'll just read a little bit. So as you mentioned, this is a story about a family that's been separated by immigration deportation, who are trying to find their way back to one another. So I'm going to read a little bit from almost the end of the book. And this is the mother of the family, Elena, who's awaiting the return of the child that she sent back to Colombia 15 years ago, who she hasn't seen in person in 15 years. So she's having a lot of feelings about that. And she also has a daughter and a son in the United States with her. Friends told Elena that when a child and a parent are reunited after so many years apart, the distance and time can be more difficult to breach than either anticipated. They warned her not to have unrealistic expectations for her daughter's attachment to her, or for her family's bonding once she arrived. She tried to prepare herself for possible outcomes. She knew that when Thalia landed, she might feel so overwhelmed with the deluge of English, the vacillating weather, so far from her city and mountains, she might eventually beg for a return ticket home. So Elena budgeted some money in case. She would not deny her daughter the right to go back to Colombia the way she denied it to herself. She knew Mauro's arms would be hard for her daughter to leave and accepted that after so many years apart, she likely loved her father far more. She blamed herself for displacing her own children, especially her girls. Karina and Thalia, binational, each born in one country and raised in another like repotted flowers, creatures forced to live in the wrong habitat. She'd watched the child who came to her that winter in Delaware grow through photographs and phone lines. Her voice was always new when they spoke. Her other children had lost much of their Spanish, and sometimes Elena imagined it was Thalia, the daughter she did not raise, yet who had grown up in the same house as her mother, who knew her best. When Karina and Nando were small, living in those cramped basements, they asked Elena why they didn't have a house of their own like the families on TV. We have a house, she told them. We just don't live in it because it's far away. But why? They asked over and over. Because we live here, she would say, wishing there was a way they could comprehend what even she could not. She was never sure if she made the right decision in staying. Eventually, she'd understand that in matters of migration, even accidental, no option is more moral than another. There is only the path you make. Any other would be just as wrong or right. Lately, when they spoke on the phone, Mauro told Elena the news abroad showed a United States scorching with civilian massacres, as bad or worse than Colombia's ghastliest days of warfare, when ordinary Americans were more heavily armed than any guerrilla or paramilitary fighter ever was. And was it true, he asked, the stories of cities contaminated by the water supply, children killed by police with impunity, communities left to fend for themselves against natural disasters as bad as the earthquakes and mudslides their land endured? How could people still think of Gringolandia as some promised land, knowing those things happened there? She rarely remembered any danger when she thought of her homeland. Lies often accompany longing, but it was worth something that she'd never been hurt or had to hide from anyone the way she'd had to do in the United States. Her birthplace had its own bigotry, inequality, terrorism, oil spills, water contaminations, and poverty, just like in the North. But every nation in the Americas had a hidden history of internal violence. It just wore different masks, carried different weapons, and justified itself with different stories. She couldn't guarantee to Mauro or to anyone that this country was safer than any other, or even that it offered more advantages or opportunity. Not anymore. She could only meet Thalia with the love she'd been guarding for 15 years. Her daughter had 2 countries to call home. Where she made hers would be her choice. If she ever decided to leave, Elena made a silent promise to let her daughter go. She'd sustained herself on reverie of her family reunited in the North. Now that her youngest was due to arrive in a few days, a new dream took shape, that of returning with her children to Colombia, possibly on the day they'd spent years wishing for, when they were each granted permission to travel freely, to navigate the routes between their nations without fear of detention or exile. There, she saw Mauro waiting for them at the airport, ready to fold them into his wings. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great excerpt to read because I think that it both shows the beauty of the language and it also shows, I think, why it's such a encapsulates the mission of this award in a way, and just dovetails so nicely into the questions I have for you. I think my first question is that in some ways the novel also feels to me like a manifesto, and it feels like it's really responding to the present moment. And I just, without saying more on my end, I want to hear from you about, how you came to write the book and, what was the source of its sort of fire.
Well, that's a really good question, Irena. Thank you. Well, it does feel, I think, like the present moment, because the fact is this is sort of an eternal moment for immigrants and families like this, especially mixed status families. This is not a new story. It's not a story of now. In fact, it's a very old one. Infinite Country is set over 20 years and it begins in the late 1990s. So if the story feels timely, it's because we have not yet dealt with these situations, and they're just perennial, and it will always be that way until attitudes and laws change in order to accommodate the vast spectrum of statuses that exist for those who are moving from one country to another.
Yeah, and I mean, and it has that sort of, it has a sense of sort of like, I'm fed up, I need to say something about this situation. You sort of feel like the urgency there. And what I really loved about it was the way it sort of complicated this narrative of immigration that maybe some American readers might be coming to. For example, this myth that immigration is an obvious choice, for example, right? This sort of false binary of your country is bad and America is good, right? It's sort of exactly what you had just sort of read. The idea that once you get here, it's easy, so it almost feels like one step at a time, you're sort of responding to all these assumptions that people might have here about what immigration is like. And I'm wondering, did you picture the reader in your mind as you were writing the book? Did you picture who would pick up the book? Did you have a sense of audience at all, or not at all?
Well, my audience always begins with me and only me, because as you know, as a writer, you have to spend a lot of time alone with your work before anybody else sets eyes on it. Infinite Country is my fourth book, but in some ways it could have just as easily been my first. I think it was because it's so close to me. I think it was my fourth because it took me a long time to get there emotionally and intellectually to understand how I would approach these things. But really, the story of this family in Infinite Country is extremely typical. This situation is extremely common. And it's so common, and what stuns me is that we don't see enough of these stories in contemporary literature. So perhaps my original impulses, came from there, which is a common impulse for any writer, is you write the stories that you want to see, that you want to read, that you feel that you needed. But also, I wanted to write a family story. I wanted to move beyond just a singular experience and really show how the collective experience of a family being in the process of immigration, where it's part of their living history at the moment, how they're all affected by that decision, but also in a way that would speak to the private experiences of each of those family members. And I also wanted to write into a space that I hadn't seen much of in literature, which is that nuanced space, a very complicated space of immigration, which is, as you said, not so cut and dry. A lot of people have this idea, immigration is like you walk in the door to the United States and you're here, and it's just a matter of geography, and your old life somehow dies. That's not what I experienced in my family and in my communities. In all my life, it's much more complicated. It's full of loss, mourning, desperate homesickness, regret, often wondering if you made the right choice, especially if you've left family and loved ones behind. And then it's kind of like your life goes on without you there, and you become sort of a ghost self, a split self. It's so psychologically complex. And I wanted to hold space for that in this book and show that there's no moment where you arrive and suddenly say, I'm here, this is the life I wanted. For some people, that never happens. And it's a huge burden for a lot of people to be the ones, the ones who made the leap from one country to another, whether it was by choice or just by circumstance, was to be the one that changes the family history forever, so that the next generation will be different, and as the generations go on, you get further and further away from what you were, And that's a heavy burden for a lot of people, and it comes with great pain. And I think that once we sort of acknowledge that pain and give a forum for it and start talking about it, well, then it becomes much easier for people to understand who don't have that experience of immigration in their family's recent history, but also for those of us who do, to be able to understand ourselves better.
Yeah, that was, for me, it was just so great. It's exactly the kind of book I wish that I could have read too when I was first trying to figure out my identity. I think at the beginning, there's that sense of binary. I think the hyphen gives that impression, right, that it is somehow one side or another, that there's some kind of choice to be made at all, actually. And I was really interested in what you said about that you wanted to explore all the different family members. And I was really interested in that choice sort of as a writer that you made. So sort of like, rather than sort of picking one character, and following their narrative, right, the perspective here touches on multiple members of the family. So I wondered how you decided that that's the way the story had to be told, if that had like sort of a more complete sense, having that camera panning around in a certain way to all the members of the family, rather than say, Talia or, any of the other children exclusively.
It was a lot of experimentation, and I have to say a really substantial part of my writing process is just daydreaming about the story and taking notes and just thinking it out and trying to visualize it. I wanted to write to the collective experience in a chronicle way. And so as the more I thought about it, I thought, well, you can't really explain what happened to Talia without understanding how her parents met and fall in love and how they ended up on their trajectory. And you can't really even approach her parents' story without talking about the baby they already had, right? And then you can't even explain anything about where they are now without talking with the next baby who was born, who was the reason they decided to stay. So when I started to understand the logic of the story, and it's almost as if it was telling me how it needed to be written. And there's no formula. It's really a very sort of impressionistic. But at a certain point, I kind of have to back off and let the story communicate its own designs to me.
And I think it really also understood the sense of who was actually going to be the chroniclers, right, at the end of the day, by very virtue of immigration, that it's really the children, right, that in a way are the storytellers, right, in a certain way. Did you think about that sense of the parent and the child, the role of the parent immigrant or the older immigrant versus the child immigrant?
Yeah, absolutely, because when people immigrate, very often the only thing they take with them is their stories. And often it's the only thing that the next generation will inherit. And so stories become even more important to repeat, to keep telling, so they remember them, because, they're lost as quick as language, which we know goes very quickly from one generation to the next. It's very hard to hold on to. And stories are the same way, the stories that allow us to understand who we were, who we used to be. And what our homeland was, and what our ancestral land, the lessons that our ancestral land had to share with us, which is why you see a lot of the Andean mythology and ancestral knowledge in this book as well. And then I also think, when in the case of immigrant families, the story of how we got to this country becomes our mythology. It's the story we tell, we share, we tell, and it's how we come to understand ourselves. And again, that's something that the next generation, as you said, has the responsibility to hold on to repeat, because again, all of this is so easily lost.
Mm-hmm. So, I thought the plot, sort of as a writer, I'm always so interested in plot and structure, obviously. And what I found here was this plot was really propulsive in the way that you set up this sort of ticking clock, right, in the present day narrative of Talia needing to arrive to an airport over the course of a week. And then that is sort of interspersed with this past narrative. And in some ways they sort of come together, and the story sort of continues from there. So you talked a little bit about your process of sort of, writing your way into that. How did the actual structure of the novel come to you?
Well, I love that you appreciate that, because I'm also a plot junkie myself. I can tell you that right behind me are my notebooks. I have just stacks of notebooks, and there's no sort of, probably nobody could decipher anything that's in them except me. It's just my mind like explaining itself to me, and so that structure was just, I just wrote it out in notes and notes and notes, and somehow it started to solidify and concretize. And what I wanted was to write a lean, tight book that felt urgent, that felt like a conversation, that you meet a stranger, you strike up a conversation with them, and they share it with you just like in one long conversational breath. So I wanted it to have that kind of intimacy and urgency, and then I had to figure out how to do it. The timeline of Talia breaking out of the juvenile correctional facility, that came from a news story that I heard about a group of teenage girls who did that, who broke out of a correctional facility in the Andes Mountains. And I just was, captivated by that. So that sort of was the jump off point. And that, of course, is her migratory story. That's her movement story. And it sort of parallels, the one that you learned about her family. And then it just came, to sculpting and finessing and doing all the things that we writers do.
And what was the hardest part for you? I'm always curious, what was like the most challenging? Which part was the thing that you thought like, oh, I don't know if I can pull this off. This is so hard.
Everything is the short answer. I did an event with this organization, United We Dream, recently, which, they're undocumented youth mostly, and they do a lot of advocacy. And they asked me a really interesting question, which was, how did I take care of myself in the writing of this book? And I really thought about it. And I think I had to do all that before I wrote the book. There were a lot of things I needed to sort out. Emotionally, internally, a lot of things I needed to reconcile before I had sort of the psychology to say to express what I wanted to express with this book. And one of the things you spoke to before, which is like very of our generation, which is the hyphenated identity. Because I think as I've gotten older, I've really started to reject that. Mm-hmm. And I really think a hyphen is a very small space to exist in. Mm-hmm. And I really started to kind of embrace the power of being diasporic and belonging to everywhere, and that, not to allow yourself to, your selfhood to be, first of all, confined by either paperwork or borders. So once I started to think about that and what it really means to be, a being, a human animal on this earth that is designed to move for survival, and then think about, my own family story and the story of so many people that I love, and then the story of this family, and it just all started to come together. But that's why I say I do so much of my work beforehand and just sort of my dreaming out about a project.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It just shows how much work we do before we even start writing. And that's so unseen often. But I think that contributes to why this book feels like this perfect little document, like so is thought through from beginning to end. It has this just beautiful symmetry and perfection of form. And I'm completely in agreement with you about the hyphenated identity and what we've sort of had to work through as immigrants here to sort of reject that binary simplicity. And so the final question I have for you, because I think we have one more minute, is if what you just said sort of defines the term infinite country as you see it. Can you speak to the title and to the meaning of the title?
Well, as you learn when you read it, the title comes from a line very near the end of the book, and it speaks to the limitlessness of of love and how that can sustain distance and separation in different ways. So I think that infinite countries exist within the realm of love, within our own minds, within our souls, our spirituality. I think it's, really, it's of our own designs.
I love that so much. Thank you so much for talking with us here, Patricia. It was just congratulations again. I urge everybody to pick up this book immediately. It is so beautiful and important. And now we're going to go back to Jim and wrap up our program.
Thank you.
Great. I mean, this has been quite a conversation, and I think the talent found in new American authors was so apparent during this conversation. And I think the sort of poignant portrayal of the work and the drive that's found behind the work. And I think that's so important, that this didn't, Patricia, you did a great job of presenting that you didn't just write this book. You had to live through it. You had to work through it. You have your notebooks behind you. And that's so important. And I think the other thing is it tells us that there are thousands of others who are living the same experience, not having their words put on paper, read by so many people, but they're still living that life. And that is so important to get people to recognize. And I really think your comments were so spot on in response to Irena's question about the binary and how, I've been teaching my students today, actually yesterday in one of my classes about the difference between the words dilemma, binary, and conundrum. And I think, really what you come across describing is the conundrum, the sort of messy circumstances that people are living through, particularly as immigrants and becoming new Americans. And I think that was a really important part of the discussion tonight. And so I would echo what Irena just said. People should pick up your book and the other books of the finalists. There is a buy the book button down at the bottom of the page. And finally, I want to also thank the judges. I want to thank the Immigrant Learning Center for helping us facilitate this opportunity, to the authors, to not only to our finalists, but to all the entrants who gave the judges the chance to review their work and show the variety of new American voices. And I'd like to thank all of you tonight who were here to participate for spending your time and learning about new American voices. And finally, the judges, Irena, Justin Torres, and Melissa Rivero, part of me envies you in being able to read all these books, but I also realize it is a huge time commitment. And we are very thankful to you for putting in the time and making your well-informed choice. So with that, I would like to say goodnight to everyone and look forward to seeing you next year.